Welcome to a real business of wine session on wine labels. And this is one of the most exciting to me because what seems like 100 years ago, but it's actually still a long time ago, in 1989, I wrote the book, the cover of which is behind you, The Art of the Wine Label. And at the time, I think it was only the second time anyone had done a book on wine labels. I was very badly paid for doing it, but I actually was fascinated. And I was fascinated at the time in what was then quite a lot of novelties, where people were beginning to use animals and calligraphy and all sorts of things like that that I included in the book at the time. And since then, there's a whole lot of other books that seem to have appeared on the whole business of wine labels. I've become involved in wine production and consultancy, and I've worked with one of the best wine label designers that I know of, a guy called Kevin Shaw of Stranger and Stranger, in terms of some wines. But I've got one of the other equally great wine label designers who I've known probably even longer than Kevin Shaw, Neil Tully, Master of Wine, it doesn't say that under his name, who is unusual in both having gone through the whole Master of Wine process and being an extraordinarily skillful wine label designer. And so somebody who understands the liquid as well as everything else that goes with it. Oh, his name has now got its MW on it. So, and what we're going to do today is Neil is going to go through the whole process of how a successful wine gets the label it does. And about halfway through the session, we're going to actually try and do something a little bit different. And we're going to work together on a real project. And we're going to brainstorm some of the ways that one does this in terms of actually producing a label. We're not going to have the finished label at the end, of course we're not, but we're going to have actually gone through some of the questions that you would have discussed between the client, the wine producer, the distributor, and the designer in Neil's case. So Neil, Amphora Studios. Which sort of companies have you worked? What sort of brands have you worked on, Neil?
Robert, thank you. We worked really the three layers of the industry. We work directly with producers and growers. We work with brand owners, importers, and we work with some of the major retailers. And the account a third of our business, each of them. We created, if anyone's got a long enough memory, Kumala from South Africa in the very early days, which grew and became a very fastest growing wine brand at the time. We developed a French Cote Du Rhone brand called Les Dauphins, which we're going to talk about a little bit later on. We've done work for some of the major UK supermarkets and some of the supermarkets overseas. So it's a broad spread. Our smallest client makes 1 barrel of Pinot Noir a year in southern Germany. Our biggest client imports giant amounts of wine. So there's a broad spread there.
And so today you've done a little bit of some slides that we can look at as we're going to go through the session, which I thought was an interesting approach. And you started with the real basics of what people expect when they're looking at bottles of wine.
Yes, absolutely. Polly, I wonder if you could put up the first slide and we'll jump straight in there. I've spent an inordinate amount of time looking at bottles, considering the visual language. And, you know, all our work is around, in a very small area of paper on a bottle, communicating huge amounts of information. And it's not always about what people are actually reading. Very often it's about what they're seeing. And we have to really use that language in a very articulate and clever way in order to be able to communicate the right messages to the right people at the right time. And I just would love to be able to demonstrate the way that very often we all know what we are looking at. So if we can go on to the next slide. We know what these are, don't we? You don't even need to blink, surely. It's instant. We have a bottle of Burgundy here, we have a bottle of Bordeaux here. Quite clear, yes? But if you look really carefully, which is the Burgundy and which is the Bordeaux? The Bordeaux's on the left. And we did this kind of personality transplant on two absolute classics. And I think it proves really interestingly that it's the visual codes, it's the bottle shape, the bottle label format, the type of images that are used, the way the typography is used, that actually speaks way more loudly than what is actually written on the bottle. So if we click over to the next slide, please. There we are. They're returned to normal. Maybe you can go backwards again. Yeah.
So Neil, can I just interrupt here where if I look at wines like Shiraz, for example, where certainly in places like South Africa, New Zealand, there are people who are playing with Syrah and Shiraz and sometimes using the word Shiraz, sometimes Syrah, but they're putting that grape into a Burgundy shaped bottle or a Bordeaux shaped bottle. And is that something that you end up having to discuss with clients? And that's true of Rioja. It's quite a lot of wines that we can think of that are, and indeed even if you think you mentioned a Burgundy, a German Pinot Noir earlier. What about Riesling in a Burgundy bottle, for argument's sake?
It's, at the end of the day, the communication is a mixture of many different messages. I was just a bit earlier today talking to a client about a very contemporary Riesling from Australia that's in a flute, and because of the market it's targeted at, we needed to make sure the label was pulling away from that very traditional bottle. Also, there are many established cues for, let's say, Australian Riesling. So the bottle is really vital in terms of the message it's sending out. And to pick up on your point about Shiraz Syrah, yeah, I would say perhaps as a rule, if something's modelled in a Northern Rhone style, a Burgundy bottle might confirm that notion about the styling of the wine. And if it's called Syrah, that would also underline that. So then we go to Shiraz, maybe from the Barossa, Langhorne Creek. Maybe Bordeaux bottle, I'm already expecting something different before I've even read the label. So yeah, here we are, we've got the Burgundy Bordeaux bottle, so you can compare like, and Polly, the last one, we see the Bordeaux. I think the next slide, there we go.
But before we just move on Brilliant. To the next stage, what about, I think it's one of the things that strikes me, there was a conversation online today about wine innovation, and somebody was trying to say how innovative Provence has been because there are a few different shaped bottles. But it is interesting, to be fair, how Provence is one of the few places in the world where you've got 5 or 6 different bottle shapes on a shelf, or certainly 3 or 4, where actually all Burgundy seems to come in that bottle, all Bordeaux seems to come in the other bottle. Is there any reason why we shouldn't be more innovative with bottle shapes? Why does everything have to be in the small repertoire of shapes that we have?
This is possibly not the answer you want to hear, or lots of people would want to hear, and possibly even we as designers don't want to hear, is that it's often an economic situation, that it's costly to change a line, to book a bottling slot, on a line that's maybe otherwise going to be using a certain shape and size bottle. It's actually a lower risk, smaller investment, change the label. So the slightly brutally honest answer there is I think there are very often cost and logistic factors that tend not to support changing a bottle just because you can. However, that means that those who do choose to do that can actually make a much greater impact as long as it's an appropriate bottle. But often, sometimes, if there's a very unusual bottle shape, then we find we're being asked to produce a label that is reassuring and maybe just to help anchor the thing. So again, it's a balance between... how orthodox or unorthodox the bottle is versus the label that's being put onto it.
Philip Quake, who's a regular attendee who's based in Moldova, said the glass mold, a new one's about 25,000 euros. I don't know the exact figure, but I do know that actually you don't need that big an order for a commercial wine to consider having a different bottle, do you? Essentially, for a commercial wine that's going to go into a supermarket, potentially it's not that impossible. And also there's a wide range of bottles on offer if one really wanted to go looking for them.
Exactly, and also it's not difficult to customize standard molds without having to commission a totally new mold, but it's possible to embellish them or to produce something that brings the changes, and sometimes that's a very successful approach because the bottle's still reassuring from a customer's point of view.
So now we're going to look at a project that you took from the beginning. You just mentioned Cote Du Rhone, and let's go through this.
Yeah, this was absolutely from the ground up. The brief that it was very much driven from the market end of things. We were working with the importer in the UK for this, although it's become an international brand, but we were very much looking at it from the UK retail shelf end of things. And I suppose in a nutshell, the brief was to produce something that both conformed, but which also stood out. It needed to feel at home amongst the Rhone fixture, but also have a lot of standout. So if we can move on to the next slide.
So mood boards, what is a mood board?
Maybe we can move on to the next slide. A mood board is, in a way, it's what it says. It's something that is designed to give an emotional feeling. It's a collection of imagery that gives us an emotion, a mood, an idea, a feeling. And two of the very important components for this were both the emotional side, which on this board we see is a lot to do with colour. There's a lot of appetite appeal. It's clearly very strongly linked to a country. There's something a little bit rusty, shabby chic about it. You know, we're looking at that typography, that very worn, faded paint. It's not self-conscious. So, you know, there are many, many moods we're pulling out of this. If you click back one, please, Polly, up to the typographic references. We also look at, you know, our lives are becoming very stripped of the typographic richness. So for this project, we're looking at type that maybe has never been near a computer, that was maybe produced on printing presses, and it has a very different feel. And I think in this day and age, digital type, actually things that have been touched by the hands of an artist or a human being do stand out.
Can I interrupt
starting
here for a second, which is that I think whether you call it calligraphy, typography, or whatever it is, and I've got a bit of a background in publishing, the importance of the typeface is something that I think a lot of people don't necessarily, they don't put enough value onto some quite subtle variations in typefaces. Is that fair?
I absolutely 100% agree, and I'm afraid I'm old enough that when I trained at art school, we were still drawing type by hand, and therefore the relationship of that U and that N isn't something that I just accept what the Mac gives me. We have to consider the positioning of it, and you know, on a wine bottle there are very few words, and therefore every single character has to be very, very carefully considered. So I absolutely 100% agree with you there. It's a vital thing, and very often.
Sorry, just interrupt again. Have you, in terms of long brands you've been involved with over time, have you tweaked the typeface over time? Have you gone back and?
I like to think we get it right first time, but just occasionally things, you know, if they bug you, then they can be looked at and they can be adjusted. But at the end of the day, I prefer things not to go out the door until they were 100% perfect. So moving on, if we can just click forward a bit here. If we can go on to the next slide there. Yeah, great. Yeah, lots of stuff does still start its life on a pen and paper. It's, you know, computers are great tools, but it's still the ideas. So very briefly, you saw there a few early sketches. It's a very good shorthand. And from that pool of visual and a number of mood boards and discussions, we begin to see we're looking at something that draws on French typographic heritage. It's got a slightly unusual label shape and format. We're working probably with a bottle with some cresting or coat of arms, because the Rhone vernacular from Châteauneuf-du-Pape downwards tends to carry that weight of detail and decoration on the bottle. So here we're considering a number of options, maybe finding a colour that's comfortable for the brand, and maybe go forward again. If we can move on to the next one, lovely. So then it becomes a finer grain set of decisions. Here's something beginning to vaguely look like the finished brand, almost getting close. The name's not yet finalized or resolved, but the whole thing crystallizing out. And, you know, overall there's a weight of decoration, and also, interestingly, very little gold. And that was a very conscious decision of this brand.
Now we have an embossed bottle, which is following on some other Rhone wines, Châteauneuf and others. The embossed, the coat of arms at the top. Exactly
that. And ultimately that moved into a custom emboss, which the brand effectively can take ownership of. But that's all part of the visual cues for wines from this part of France.
So this is the point where Andrew, before we move on for a second, Andrew Halliwell's raised the question, don't typefaces evolve over time? What might have been right 10 years ago can look dated over time. But I guess that may be the difference between a new world modern label, for example, or something like this where you're using a classic typography that is deliberately of its time, and somebody else has referred to, Stan Roberts referred to Châteauneuf as always having its own look. But if you were launching if you like, a 21st century brand, might you be thinking of actually having to react to style changes on a typeface there? If you were doing a 19 Crimes or any of those sort of.
Can I add something to this question? Which is in the past few years, we've seen a real move of luxury brands moving toward very easy to read, blocky styling. And one of the theories has been because it caters to non-English as a first language audiences. Do we have to factor, decorative typefaces and the ability for our non-English audiences, or not even English? Let's just say our Asian audiences specifically is who they're doing it for, to understand what's on the bottle.
I think occasionally, yes. I think also, though, for non-English speaking markets, it can often be about a really recognizable symbol. So actually reading the name or the descriptor may be of secondary importance above having an icon or a symbol that represents the brand. But also I think some words actually look better in some typefaces than other words. There's something around finding a sweet spot where it's clearest and most instantly recognizable. I don't believe maybe in the Chinese market that Penfolds is a signature, and that may well be read as more of a signature than necessarily the literal meaning of it. So I think there's an interesting area around brand names that become symbolic signatures, if you like.
And so I notice on this one, you are working with your client for the naming. What are the issues around clients coming to you with, they're dead set on a name, they've got this idea, or should they be more fluid and work with their designer and their design teams from day one, even before they've got that name, that URL, everything is set in stone?
There's not a particularly easy or straightforward answer to that one. Sometimes we find ourselves saying, this is a crazy name, but we will grow into it. And brands do sometimes have a habit of growing into their names if they're good brands. Sometimes there can be a real preoccupation with the name, and sometimes I have to advise people to say, let's just put that right out of the way. Let's let the design evolve, and it will tell us what it's going. It's like watching a child grow up. You know, if you could dare to do it, to say, well, I'm going to wait till this child's 2.5, and then I'll know whether they're this or that. And occasionally we will say the client can be very, very anxious about the naming, but we can say, let's let the design start happening. We know what the personality is. We know what the market is going to need to talk to, but let's not get hung up on the name, because eventually, and then sooner or later there's a meeting and suddenly the name's there in front of us. And I do sometimes think if it can grow naturally from the creative process, then that can often be very right, and it's a bit less less of an anxious thing for the people involved. It does take a lot of faith in the whole team to do that, but we've seen good results that way.
Can I backtrack a bit? Philip Quick has raised another question, which I think is not unreasonable. He's looking at this label and saying, are you misleading the customer a bit in the sense that, does it look like a Chateau Neuf? Is it something that some people who don't know much about wine are going to take home thinking of that? To my mind, of course, we've now got embossed Cote Du Rhone, sort of official Cote Du Rhone embossed bottles, I guess. But I think that question of reference is quite an interesting one, and I'd like just quickly to broaden that. If we are going to head into financially tougher times, which is not impossible, one of the things that I'm hearing is that people, if we go back to 2007, 2008, 2009, a lot of the new product development work pretty much stopped or slowed down, and a lot of people went back to much more traditional packaging and labeling, because consumers, when they've got less money, take fewer risks, and they tend to go for what they think of as tried and tested. Was that your experience? And B, how important is the kind of familiar reference to people?
Yeah, I mean, maybe Polly, if we can click onto the finals on the next slide, which shows the final design, there were a few choices and decisions taken around the execution. And yes, I think if we wanted to portray this as a baby Chateauneuf du Pape, we might well have been looking at using Gothic typography. We might have played up the armorials a little bit more. In fact, this was placed in a slightly more sort of fin de siècle Paris, a Parisian place, rather than necessarily in the Rhone. But I take your point that there are a few echoes of the Rhone semiotics, visual cues. The label, in the end, it was printed on uncoated paper. It had no gold at all. There's a sort of strange brownish amber colour that looks like it's representing gold. So in a way, it was down-specced. And I was really keen that we kept it like that, because it gave it an honesty. And I think that's something that, again, gave it a kind of classless quality that is quite difficult to position, whether it's $4.99 or $14.99. And I think that was a very interesting thing to be able to do with this particular wine. So yes, it's full.
Sorry, I've got two things. Just thinking of what's happening in the chat in the background, which is interesting. Stan Novak, who I think is in Russia, has pointed out that blue is often an unpopular color on labels, but on the other hand, Lorenzo Biscontin from Italy has noted that the La Marca, the Gallo La Marca Prosecco, is hugely successful. And has worked incredibly well.
We put together a whole range of wines for Waitrose, their mid-tier, which has been very successful, which uses blue labels. And I did a very big piece early on to be sure that we weren't going to propose something that would be commercially disastrous. And possibly now isn't the moment to go into that, all the theory around it, but there's some very interesting thinking on blue as a food colour, as a wine colour. And very briefly, I'll say, I wish I could put a mood board up, which we looked into the relationship of blue with food and wine. And I would say, in short, it's a foil to food and wine, but it's not a colour that's of food and wine. And I think if we can unravel those differences, then you can understand how it can work. As I say, there's a range out there called Blueprints. That's the Waitrose core range, and
I know that Robert Weil, when they had their, which are now iconic blue labels, there was a lot of discussion and kickback at the time in Germany about, no, this doesn't work. Next, do we move on from to what happened next? So
yeah, very quickly, this is an interesting one because it just shows it benchmarked against the competitive set, some pretty well-known brands and producer labels out there. And really that was the objective. It should sit comfortably there as belonging to the Rhone, but at the same time standing out. And the proof of the pudding is very often on a bottle in 3D out there on the shelf, and we can then see whether it's actually doing the job it's meant to do. Okay, moving on. And then really just looking at how visually, this is a visual brand. As we as designers love this when it gets picked up in social media. We can move on. We've got the next slide, yep. And a photographic blog as well. I mean, this is enormously gratifying. The bag became the icon, that's nice. And actually then the design has translated into markets overseas. The next slide, I think, shows it as its Chinese iteration. There we go, good colors. Okay, and the next one. We got another slide there. Yes, just a very quick glimpse into the bigger brand world. A lot of work done on where it goes beyond the bottle. And this is neat because we actually have seen others taking the design and generating something that looks remarkably like it.
But getting it right, as far as I can see, given where we started this little segment with, it seems to me to get that so wrong that the label seems to be dull and earthy and lacking in joy. Where the one that you've done is, it makes me think of actually having fun in a French bistro. This certainly isn't a bottle that I'd be picking up off the shelf.
No, it somehow looks a bit ponderous, I think. And yeah, it's interesting to see that it doesn't seem to work even on that bottle shape, but interesting thing to see happening.
A nice point in the chat there from Lorenzo, who is a consultant in Italy and used to work with Santa Margherita. It's surprising how few marketing departments in wineries have a shelf in their office to look at the packaging proposals against competitors in a real world way. And the number of wineries I've been to where they've got all their own bottles, but actually, maybe it's another room where they're doing the comparisons, but very often they're not. And I think that's really very important. So now I think we're kind of on time, remarkably on time to be going into the next phase of the game we're going to play this evening. So this is a real project, and in fact, amongst the participants is a great winemaker with whom I'm working on this project. I'm really delighted that he's here, and this is a project that we are literally we've made the wine, we've blended the wine, we made a small amount last year. Of both red, and we make various blends, and we've come up with the styles that we like. We've shown the styles to some potential buyers who've liked them, but nobody knows what the brand is going to be called or what it's going to look like. And actually, we're not this evening going to actually discuss what it's going to be called, because that's still being worked on, as Neil said. But let's say we're going to call it George as a code name for a Georgian wine. And what is innovative about it? It is blending wine that's been in amphora, the Kvevari amphoras, and wine that's been made in stainless steel. And so it's not necessarily what most people are going to expect from a Georgian wine. And it's intended for sale in restaurants and specialist shops internationally for about $15 to $20. Go to the next page, please, Polly. And it's a sizable high quality producer. The joint venture is with me, and the point is they're traditional Georgian grapes, which most people won't necessarily know. There's going to be some Saperavi and some Riccazzatelli, but there are other grapes that people won't know. And it's not necessarily regional. It's made from a blend from the two main regions of Kakheti and Imereti. So now the first question, I'm going to go back to you, Neil. In terms of the 2 slides you've just seen as the brief, how does that compare with what you're normally given when they came to you with Les Dauphins, or when you see clients, not necessarily clients you've worked with for a long time, who obviously know how to work with you? How does this compare with the brief you normally get, and how much more do you need than you've seen in those 2 slides?
Sure. I think on these 2 slides, it outlines the nature of the project very well. Right at the top of our agenda is very often understanding what the commercial and strategic objectives are of a project. With design awards, it's lovely to win design awards, but nothing makes me happier than when people say we've just sold 26,000 bottles last week or something. Because at the end of the day, if people don't buy it, none of us really have jobs. So, and I do believe that by very accurately tailoring something to its market, that we can achieve the objectives that the client has commercially. So what I would love to be asking, to add another layer to a brief like this, is where is the target market? Now, it may be many markets, it may be not an easily quantifiable thing, but at the end of the day, I think we have to share a commercial vision around where is this going to go? What job are we setting it out to do in the world? Those bottles may not have anyone with them to help them jump off that shelf. So we've got to really be clear about what those bottles have got to do, what job we've got to send them out into the world to do. It might be to look avant-garde and shocking and get a lot of attention, or it could be to quietly be there and be reassuring. They're both very different things. It could be a bit of both. So it's often quite fine-grained and nuanced, but by looking really carefully about what the objectives are, where it needs to go, and then we can build that in as a layer. I often think there's a sort of push element to the brief and there's a pull element to the brief. Very often when we're talking to producers, they're very focused on the push, understandably. So we can maybe represent the pull part of the market and say, well, what do people actually want to see? And then we can build the look in order to create an enduring brand, which fulfills all the creative objectives, but also can fulfill the commercial objectives.
So let's pick up on that. So it's interesting. So Stephanie Gallo, who we're going to have here in I think, 2 or 3 weeks' time, a long conversation with her about what Gallo does. Gallo launches lots of different test wines into test markets. And she said, we always think we know who the wine is for. And we do a lot of testing, and we do a lot of focus groups and all sorts of other work. And sometimes we get it wrong. And she said there's one wine we thought was for soccer moms, for 30 to 40-year-old women, going to be at home. They're the same people who might be drinking barefoot and cupcake and so on. And what we found was that this wine, when we got into the market, was selling incredibly well to gay men in other cities. And they had to sit down and say, well, actually, this wasn't our target. Now, what do we do with it? Do we have to remarket it to our target? Or do we say, these are the people who are buying our wine, let's satisfy them? So let's look at what I'm talking about here. Somebody, Philip Quick, said, well, Moscow would be your target market because Russia buys a lot of Georgian wine. No, this is an international, innovative wine. I'm looking at New York. I'm looking at Boston. I'm looking at Chicago. I'm also looking at Canada. And I think that potentially the UK is in there. The price is a little bit high for the UK possibly, but we're talking about restaurants, we're talking about specialist shops. So I'd like sommeliers to understand this wine. I'd like them to feel happy about putting it onto a table at a reasonable price. I'd like it to work in an independent retailer. It doesn't have to stand out on the supermarket shelf necessarily in the way that possibly the brand we've just looked at does. It has to justify that price that we're looking at. And I think the buyer is most likely not old, because he or she is not going to be a conservative old buyer because it's innovative. I presume they're going to be a bit adventurous because it's not necessarily going to be one of the wines they necessarily know. And I think they're looking for something that is a slightly different experience, but I'm not looking for them necessarily to be as brave as somebody buying an orange wine or a wine that's completely out of their comfort. So I'd like them to feel comfortable with spending that $15 on it in a New York wine shop, for example, or if it is going to be in a supermarket, it's going to be a supermarket with a pretty serious wine offering. Waitrose might fit that if you like, but it's certainly not the cheap supermarket wall of wine, ideally. Does that help you, or do you want more?
I think that's enormously helpful, and I think it also asks the question, and it's a really critical one, is of those segments of the market, what is their level of awareness of Georgian wine, or what would you imagine it to be? Because, you know, I think if it can play to people's curiosity, that's really powerful and quite emotive with wine. If somebody has never even heard of Georgia in a wine context, then it has to do a really different job than it's, oh, well, yes, I think I heard about Georgia once. Hasn't it got a really old wine producing history or something about clay pots? And if we've even got that glimmer of recognition, then the brand can actually, I think, work really well to begin to build something on potentially the lack of knowledge, but the natural curiosity, which drives quite a lot of engagement with wine.
So that's a very interesting question, because I don't think I'm making here or looking for the traditional Georgian buyer, because I think they're going to go possibly for a less innovative wine, and there are not very many of them. I think there are a lot of people, including those sommeliers we've been talking about, who've heard about Georgia, as you've just said. They're slightly aware, and they want something they're ready to explore, but they're certainly not necessarily looking for the old necessarily the old cues that you might go back to. So I think we are looking to push the innovative part of this story. But I think a sense of what Matt Kramer wonderfully called a sense of somewhere-ness is important.
Yeah.
I think this is certainly a wine that has to come from somewhere. That somewhere is Georgia, and there are various stories and mysterious elements to Georgia that are interesting. Now, you've done some mood boards for Georgia, haven't you?
We have. I mean, just beginning to pull out some themes and ideas, and this is absolutely not by way of this is where we think it should go, or this is what we think this should be about. It's a way of putting images and ideas down for discussion, to bounce ideas off, even if it's for us to say, we definitely know this is not where we want to be going. So, but ultimately it begins to compose the DNA, I suppose, that we look to explore further. And from time to time, it can just be the one corner of one image that occasionally somebody will say, hey, that is my touchstone. There's something about that totally is exciting, and we need to grow something from that seed of an idea. So the perhaps most obvious place to begin is the heritage of Georgia. Well, what is that? Yes, it's got a winemaking history going back to 5000 BC, possibly even further. So there are very, very strong links into Georgian culture and life that are very much rooted in wine and the vine. And that's massively exciting and powerful and useful. We've got St. George down here on the left. Jason and the Golden Fleece, I didn't know, kind of occurred in Georgia.
Slightly bothered, Neil, if I can interrupt, I'm slightly bothered about, I know St. George is the patron saint of Georgia and indeed of England, but what he's doing there, it seems to me, is killing a dragon. And I quite like to sell my wine in China, and they're quite fond of dragons in China. But I'm not entirely sure.
Well,
I'm not entirely sure that dragon killing is going to help my sales.
Not ideal. That's a good point. So we've learned something instantly, that the dragon slaying is out.
We have the old priest there, which is a very iconic the Orthodox Church in Georgia is very strong, and we've got the obviously the amphora,
Yes.
and there are a lot of monasteries, like the one in the sort of almost Van Gogh-y picture you've got in the middle.
Yeah.
And those are very iconically Georgian. Now, the question I've got, somebody else has asked earlier in the day, if you were to put one of those monasteries on our label, does that mean we're implying that the wine was made by monks, or if it's not made by monks, are we cheating the consumer if we use that?
I think I want to be very careful about using any specific reference such as that, because there are monasteries who do make wine, and to be accused of passing off is not something this needs to do. And actually, is that uniquely Georgian enough? There are many wine producing districts that have ecclesiastical connections. So I don't think in itself it would be enough to distinguish a brand. However, we're acknowledging here that there is a connection, and it takes it right back to some of the very beginnings. But that's that's potentially a difficult area to be in any case, if we're talking about a brand that's going to have a broad and widespread appeal. So again, to acknowledge that there are some areas that are best maybe avoided, or being very careful about how we allude to them, if indeed we do. And likewise,
Polly, can we move on to the next? I think you've got another board, haven't you, coming up? So this is extraordinary. I always say that Georgian writing very often makes me think of bottoms, either going up or going down. But it's a unique language which really stands alone in the world, and is, I find, not surprisingly, totally impenetrable, but glorious to look at. You talked earlier about typography. There's a lot going on there.
Yes, there is. And even just in the center, slightly to the left, and that is one of the indigenous grape varieties written out in Georgian. But look at those three characters actually look like Qvevri, which is great. So the shapes are all there. It's fairly unique, in fact. And I don't know exactly what's going on to the right of that, but there are things that almost look like vine leaves, and this calligraphy seems to have kind of grown into a whole world of its own. So, and it looks remarkably contemporary, as well as being ancient, as well as being authentic. So I really believe that having some fundamental truth rooted in anything, there are a lot of fake brands around, but if you look carefully enough, there's always a lot of very rich material that can be drawn into something like this. And personally, I feel this is quite rich territory to be investigating, even if it's impossible to read.
San Novak has said, do you think calligraphy can help selling wine? I think we've already said you do think that, really, and if you get it right.
Yes, I do actually. And it's about authenticity as well. And we're living in a world where it's becoming increasingly international, but here is something that absolutely is about authenticity, and I love that.
So next, where we go next? So there's our architecture, let's say, with monasteries and other.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I was in Tbilisi a few years ago and was struck by the amazing kind of verandas and balconies and open work on buildings. That it really speaks of that, crossing over of Europe and Asia. And I suppose on the Silk Road, there's all kinds of influence happening there. So there's a kind of very strong decorative feel to it, but it feels unique. It feels very much, it has a strong sense of place. And not forgetting that there are both rural, agricultural, ecclesiastical buildings, and then on the far right we've got a wonderful piece of brutalist architecture that's been revived for a bank in Tbilisi, which is just a remarkable thing altogether. So, go ahead.
In terms of colors, what's fascinating is I love the colors in your central image. And we talked about blue earlier. It's one of the things I've noticed in Georgia and Tbilisi and so on. There are some wonderful mixtures of russets and lovely shades of red, autumnal shades, with these blues that are unexpected when you look at that picture there. And the same as on that the balcony. On the picture on the left, where you've got some really vibrant blue color, which is interesting. It's almost reminiscent of your Rhone label in a way, the way the blue is.
Yes, it is. It is, and yet the pigments have got a lovely quality to them as well. So, all this begins to build up a picture. It builds up imagery, and just to find the distinctive flavour that these things have, it's really worthwhile just taking a tour of the various visual elements. Some of them are purely visual, such as typography. Some of them are very much emotional ideas about the country. We're going to come on to some of those in a moment.
I've just got a note from, again, Stan Novak in Russia, saying, recently we had a Georgian wine in our stock with a very nice name devoted to a ballerina and a dull label. The moment the label was changed, it began to sell better. So we know that labels do work.
Interesting. Yeah, interesting.
So next one, Polly. Yes, so this is what the Soviet era imagery. Yeah.
Here we are. It's this is the Marmite part of things. I'm fascinated by it. I think there's some incredibly strong design, but it also exerts a strong emotional feeling, and it may not necessarily be all positive. I think we're at a very interesting stage where there's a generation now who maybe will not be as aware of this of the Soviet era, and on a purely face value visual basis, it represents something that's very much has a sense of place, of time, but what it stands for is maybe less palatable. And we repeat the building here because I think it's very interesting that a lot of old Soviet era architecture is being rediscovered, re-embraced, repurposed, and acknowledged. So I think the baggage is there. We wouldn't be doing a job, I think, around a country such as this without looking this in the eye and seeing what is good, what's less good. But it's all part of its history and the DNA. And there's a sort of dynamism to it that I find very interesting. But we have to be very careful about how the sort of message it communicates potentially to the market who may not have quite the visual awareness that we creatives do.
Mm. So next we've got and so this is the sort of imagery that is, I mean, hands and grapes, that could be, I guess, anywhere. It could be Greece, it could be Italy, anywhere. But then you've got the monastery, and then you've got some more typically Georgian down at the bottom.
Yeah, I think discovery is we hear it, many people talk to us about it from all over the world. It is quite a strong and motivating thing. I think if any country really can claim the word discovery, probably Georgia's one of them. They have 400 or more, you all know, 400 or more indigenous grape varieties, some of which only exist in little groups of 20 vines that have been preserved. I must just say for a minute, on the right-hand side, that little strange-looking box contains the earliest domesticated grapevine pips ever from the museum in Tbilisi. I was very excited to see those. So for me, that was discovery, and I'm a wine geek. But I think if there's some element of that can be brought to the mainstream wine consumer, then I think that's strongly motivating.
Ollie, you had a thought about the hands with the grapes, I think.
Well, I think that anyone who knows me knows that I have a thought about the hands with the grapes, which is, the separation between, in this case, we'll say the thinking process and the parts of it that a client, a winery client, latches onto. Because what we get on the digital side of things is that a client has gone through this process, with a designer like Neil, then they bring this to us. And what they want is for me to use these kind of images throughout their site. Like, they don't necessarily understand that this is setting a stage. It's not a prescription.
How do you feel about this, Neil? I mean, are we too close to wine? Is it that the consumer actually really loves the idea of those grapes and those hands?
Actually, can I jump in on that?
Yeah.
Because I just want to say this before Neil answers. I actually have the data that says they don't.
Again, I'm going to continue this for a second. When you say you've got the data, Polly and I worked together on this project. We've been working together for a couple of months. How global is that data? If we're talking about different countries, does that, and different ages and different demographics, does that change?
Yeah, actually, I mean, we have just seen, and this is moving into digital, not labels, but we have seen across markets and across personas, across price points, that when we use the hands with the grapes, we don't get the same kind of uptake or conversion as when we use, like, there's a picture here of a gentleman holding the basket and smiling. That would be a much more persuasive image, just from, I won't get into all the details of it, but the hands and the grapes is everywhere. It's also, unfortunately, all over stock photography. It's all over free stock photography. So now you're in a position where what you're seeing is the exact same thing that someone up the street has used. So I hijacked the conversation for a little bit, and now I'm going to shut up.
So Neil,
I think it's a
very good points being made. Thank you.
I think it's an important one, actually. And as I said, this is what going through this process is so important for, is to as much identify what not to include as what to include. And I think there's a strong emotional pull, I think, for a lot of customers. There's this notion about maybe countries that are not mainstream New World countries, about them being more rustic, about being, there's a bit more handwork involved, which may or may not be accurate, but it's around how the brand ultimately sees itself and gets seen by the market.
So where does that take us to next in your little journey? Do we have a...
Yeah.
So these are very Georgian, or at least some very Georgian images. Yeah.
They are, and it was something that we're talking about mood boards here, and this really is quite an abstract concept, is that quite independent sense of independence that it has as a country. And you can take that either literally or in a more abstract way, but it's something that really has struck me, through people I've spoken to there, what I've learned about the country. And I think it's really quite a strong driving force. So we wanted to somehow acknowledge that, using some images that may not be things that would directly translate onto packaging or digital or any other form of material, but for us to say, within all this, maybe there's something about this, here's a country that's sort of sandwiched between Europe and Asia, there's the Caucasus, but it has a real sense of itself. And if that can somehow be conveyed into whatever this wine brand becomes, that's a really nice and strong quality for it to have. And it may not be explicit, but it could be an implicit part of it.
And now we come back to the...
So here, really, these are to represent Sundstrand. They may not. Go on.
So, I've got a question. Two things come up here. One is the Georgian flag, which obviously is totally familiar to every Georgian and people who know Georgia, but the red... the fact that it is the cross of St. George, it's also the flag that a lot of English people think is their flag, except they only have one red cross and the Georgians have 5, essentially, with the one in each corner. Confusion. So I looked at a label, another project that I've been working on, with red, white and blue, the French flag. And when I was talking to our importers in Russia, they said, well, actually, that's our flag. They see red, white, and blue as being the Russian flag, and so the Frenchness wasn't going to work. They weren't going to see it as French, and everything I was trying to convey didn't work. So is that an issue when you're thinking about things like that, where there are, when you're looking at other markets, they may not understand the same cues?
Totally, totally. And, Hungary and Italy share the same colours in their flags. You just get it the wrong way around and you're flipping. So they're very strong cues and codes that have to be used extremely carefully, I would say.
And then secondly, in the center, you've got this rather more folkloric, what I call folkloric picture. And again, I've been doing some work in Moldova, which is wonderful rugs that are like this. I have a question of how premium in price folkloric labels actually go. Do you actually see wines in international markets, not so much in the local markets, that actually have that kind of very often colorful, sometimes handiwork related imagery? Does that often work at a premium, super premium level?
Look, I think it of itself, it's not a particularly sophisticated look, but if it's kind of, quoted, it could actually be very sophisticated. I'm not sure anyone's done it yet, but I think it's. I haven't got a fixed idea actually, Robert. I would say if somebody said to me, "I want to produce a super premium label based on something folkloric," I think it could be done. But of itself, I think it's just a little bit unsophisticated.
Yeah, that's right. I love the fact that the absolutely human element of it, and the history of it, and the colors, so and the handiwork, all of those seem to be very positive. Now, Lorenzo Viscontin has actually picked up on the fact we actually had a session 2 nights ago with Donna Fogata as an Italian brand, and he's made the point. Donna Fogata is a great example of a sophisticated folkloric label that works very well. And I think it's a good point, but it isn't it's certainly been worked on, let's say.
I agree, exactly. And we have to always keep open minds about these things because often it's the most unexpected things that, if they're thought about very carefully and used very carefully, can often work surprisingly well. So I always keep an open mind.
So I didn't say that we were going to have come up with the label for our Georgian project at the end of this, but there are a number of things that a number of roads we've kind of begun to go down. And I can see some possibility of using some of the folklore. I think some imagery of the buildings, whether we go for I think the point you made, and it was made earlier today, about being careful about monasteries and so on. But I think that there is something about Georgian architecture that it has, and certainly the colors and those balconies that potentially has a quality to it. And I love the typography that we looked at earlier, whether or not you would actually, obviously we're not expecting anybody to read it, but there is something there that has some mystery that I think is appealing.
I agree. And it is often just about the kilter of something. The minute you get a sort of re-entrant curve, it can go from Gothic to Arabic. And those are all read very well by people, maybe almost unconsciously, a bit like our bottles that we started with today. So it is about getting the right kilter on things. So it's all about that sort of nuance.
So in that case, now in terms of if this, and it is a real project, but in terms of how your projects work, at the end of this conversation, what would you do next? What
I would take out of this is, first of all, there are some very good learnings from it, and what's been a very informal discussion has actually raised some quite concrete points. So I think I need to sense check those back with you to be sure we know where it's going, and ultimately we'd be looking to, effectively we've got some very elementary ingredients for our cake, and maybe we're looking to sort of explore one route that focuses on one particular element being dominant with the scattering of some other parts of it. Maybe we look to develop another route using the emphasis on one of the other parts of the mood boards we've looked at. so that we can just begin to scope out perhaps the broad territory that the brand might begin to occupy.
Now, Stan Novak,
still
Stan, who's come up with a number of very good points today. He said, he's based in Russia, where they see a lot of Georgian wines. He's saying, what surprises me is that Georgia is so new for you. We're very used to it. And he said, you see what I can't. So to me, that's a bit like people coming to London and telling me about wonderful things they've seen in London that I've not noticed, because I go past them every day. And I'm looking at Georgia as an outsider. You are, as a designer, looking at it from outside. And I think that's an interesting point to make. And I think what you've done with Les Dauphins, with your French label, which is a very innovative label using very traditional French imagery, does do that, I think, very much, where you've taken Frenchness that the French didn't necessarily put on labels of wine.
Exactly. You've hit the nail on the head there. And that was a comment we received at the time. And that's not always an easy thing to guide through necessarily with, although, you know, we work with maybe people at the sales end, at the production end, sometimes that can seem a little unpalatable initially, but that's, I think, the job we have to do is to see what maybe others are not seeing. And it's like looking down the wrong end of a telescope. So I'm really delighted to hear that comment coming in.
And then going back, the other thing, just because we're slightly over time, so we're heading towards the end, but something came out of a previous session, which I think is interesting in terms of pricing, where the point was made, if you so if we're taking our price here, which is my $15 to $20, if you package this up to look like a $50 bottle, that seems like a good idea, but actually people are suspicious of something that looks too good to be true. On the other hand, if you make it look cheap, obviously you're not going to want to pay $15, $20. How do you see that aspect of that?
I think people quite frequently have come to us and said, I want to make this £5 wine look like it's £10. And I would always cancel against that, because particularly bridging that price gap in the UK market, there's a noticeable change in wine quality, and ultimately there's only disappointment from the consumer. And you know, when 5 years ago we had bog-offs and buy one get one free, and the wine quality was not reflective of the price, that resulted in disappointment from the customer. So we've always tried to accurately reflect the price quality ratio.
I've got a note from Karen Jenkins. I'm thinking that when small producers can't afford to do both logistics and economics. I'm just wondering.
It's a follow-up to her prior question about domestic versus foreign markets and how do you handle labels.
That's a good question. So I'm not necessarily thinking about selling my wine in Georgia, but I might be. But if we're looking at Les Dauphins, is Les Dauphins very much an international label from a French winery, or were they thinking about the French market as well as the overseas market?
They were absolutely not thinking about the French market. And in fact, a reasonably conscious decision was taken at the time for it not to be available in France, because they have other brands that are very successful there, and not to cannibalize it. So therefore, it was very much an outward-looking brand, and it has captured the imagination, I think, of many, many overseas markets other than the UK. So it was, yes, definitely looking out, not in.
And it's interesting because my French brand, again, the same thing we did. We looked outside, and now France has begun to discover it back again. But a lot of the things we did work very well in the United States and in other markets. And the French buyer is not necessarily used to some of the things that we've been doing.
True. That's true.
So, and how long would the process take? We've just gone through, if you like, our early, you've obviously done some work here on Georgia to create those mood boards. So you've got some ideas in your mind. So I've now got my tank of wine. How long would this next process be to actually come up with some sample labels, to create a label, and to actually have a label on a bottle? And are we going to do some focus groups, or what do we do with it?
Well, The focus group bit's over to you, I would say.
Would you normally be bearing in mind that I might want to be selling in all these different countries? Would you say, look, if we believe in it, let's go with it, or would you test?
There's a massive generalization. I think sometimes when we work on projects where we have a lot of experienced and talented people around the table, it may be about timing, it may be about budget. Extensive research can sometimes have limited usefulness. So very often our clients are prepared to trust their instincts. And I think from what we've seen over years, more often than not, that works. It can be reliable. But sometimes a client may need validation, the gatekeepers may need validation, and for that reason, research might take place. In terms of timing, normally our client gives us the deadline. So if you need to be bottling the wine in a month's time, we will advance things at that speed. If you're bottling in 2 months or 3 months, then that's fine too. So we don't often have the luxury of dictating the pace of the development, but realistically, yeah, it's weeks, not months.
And then I think this is important, something we've talked about, you and I, in the past. Your relationship with something like Les Dauphins ideally doesn't stop when you've delivered the labels. How much broader does a studio like yours go, both in terms of what's done with were you involved in those bags? Were you involved in any of the other material that happened to Les Dauphins? But by the same token, over time, are you involved in how that label evolves and how the product?
I think every client has different needs, and we have to be able to give our client enough flexibility and freedom to activate their brand. But equally, I think in terms of the integrity and the visual integrity particularly, we often can remain, if you like, guardians of the brand. And I think that's terribly important because, you know, when a brand speaks, when it behaves, what it does, all that should be in character. And sometimes there are just great, quite neat creative opportunities to do something that's maybe a little unexpected. So with Les Dauphins, yes, we were absolutely involved with anything that it did that was visual. It would be sense checked at least, if not actually authored by us. Sometimes we hand over the tools for a client to be able to bring their brand to life in other areas such as digital media, web, so on. So, but it's a long step. The brand starts on the bottle, but it doesn't finish there.
And then I think almost lastly, but so let's make, I said $15 to $20. Let's say we're moving into hard times and I might be struggling to get my $20. Maybe I'm going to be stuck with 12 to 15, but I'm thinking about good times coming along later on. And what I know is it's very hard to take my $15 wine into $25 once I've established it at 15. So maybe I'm thinking about a reserve that I might want to bring in at some other time. Are we at this stage of the process considering what the reserve version of the basic wine might be? Do you often have that in your discussions?
Yeah, I think out of the general pool of ideas from which the brand is born, sometimes there is material that people will say, well, actually not for now, but that will be great when we come to do. And I think with Georgia, it's very exciting because there's not, you know, in better established wine regions like Burgundy, Bordeaux, Rioja, we all know the difference between Reserva, Grand Reserva. There are quality ladders well understood. With Georgia, there's a great opportunity to be able to delineate something, and actually, if the quality of the wine in the bottle justifies it, it's very easy to make that step up. But you're not working within a framework of legislation or terminology that might prove to be inhibiting. So I think that's quite exciting.
And of course, with Georgia, we have fewer wines to compete with in terms of on the international market. There are some very nicely labeled and well done wines, a growing number of them in Georgia, but there aren't, compared to what you've had in France or other places, there's less competition perhaps to be thinking about. Is that fair?
May I ask, can I ask Neil a question before we wrap up as well?
Of course.
Okay, one of the questions I get all the time from clients is how do you deal with second labels? How do you deal with master brands? What are the mandates for carrying a visual identity across multiple labels? So what's your opinion on this?
My thinking on that, Polly, is that it varies, I think, from label to label, from brand to brand. I think second labels should not be the poor relations. I think the biggest challenge is that they're completely valid in their own right. And I think the market understands this better than it ever has done before. But it is possible to create something that is more accessible, but it's not second best, if that makes sense.
Should they always be a reflection of, part of a greater brand story, even if they're horizontal? Yeah, do you need to have that cohesive branding? So I'm thinking about one of our producers in New Zealand where literally every one of his labels is completely different. You wouldn't know that it's the same brand. It works really well for him, but would that work for everyone?
I think it depends really what their commercial objectives are, whether they need to get a more widely distributed, more accessible brand out there to support the main brand, or whether it has to behave totally separately in different channels so as not to threaten the main brand. Both can work, both are valid strategies, but I think that's what I want to know before developing a secondary label, diffusion brand, whatever. There are many different relationships, and you must see that from the conversations you're having with clients.
I chip in. One of the things I did some research a few years ago. This was actually talking to people who classified themselves as regular wine drinkers and at a low level of wine enthusiasm, but certainly involved with wine. Their recognition of labels and brands was incredibly weak. And even what we think of as iconic labels. So I've heard people say, oh, well, Oyster Bay was successful because it was leveraging on Cloudy Bay. Most people, certainly 10, 15 years ago, had never come across Cloudy Bay, had never heard of Cloudy Bay. Cloudy Bay was a brand known by a certain niche of wine drinkers who were prepared to pay the price for it and so on. Oyster Bay actually probably resonated with professional buyers because of Cloudy Bay. But I don't think that actually it helped, particularly when they came out into the supermarkets. I think the people picking up a bottle of Oyster Bay Sauvignon Blanc had no thought of Cloudy Bay in their head. And I think we tend to overestimate the
I agree.
consumers, and that's a danger. If you keep doing lots of different things, you keep confusing them, I suppose.
Yeah, I completely agree. And the commercial success of Oyster Bay, certainly in the UK, is as much to do with price and promotion as brand recognition. But I wouldn't subscribe to there being anything more than a passing referral to something like Cloudy Bay, because they're very different. They existed in very different sections of the market.
Now, there's one thing I've forgotten about, and it's quite important to this whole story that maybe before we do close. The one we haven't talked about is actually the style of the liquid in the bottle to the label. So the one thing we haven't said, is my red wine going to be a 15% big, intense, powerful red? Is it going to be a light, juicy 12.7% red? And the white, by the same token, is it going to be very aromatic or very oaky, whatever? How much is that actually in your mind? And you're a master of wine, so you've got more active taste buds possibly than some designers out there, if I may say so. But how we haven't talked about it, and coming down this road, how important is that going to be to you in your thinking of this label or these labels?
I think it's quite important, actually, and I think particularly around is that Chardonnay fat, tropical and oaky and warm, and are we looking at colours that radiate heat, or are we looking at something very mineral, very crystalline, very cool, and therefore colours that do not radiate heat and allude to a sort of coolness? And that's just so instinctive, and I think it can really help customers. again, with reds, there's a real parting in the road. You know, there's a few high alcohol fruit bombs out there, but there are also some really interesting, slightly juicier, more approachable, lower alcohol styles of red. And I would definitely want, not at least to perhaps make something look like a monster if it wasn't, or look delicate and charming if equally it wasn't. So no, that's entirely part of what we're doing.
Well, thank you very much. I think this has been I've really enjoyed this session. I think anybody who's watching it could get a lot out of it. And what I'm going to promise to do is, in however long it's going to be, because this is a real project, and we will, I think we have a small number of bottles, but we are going to label them, and we'll come back and we'll go through how this turned into whatever it will be.
Yeah.
And then in our YouTube channel, people can actually see how we got from here to there. So I'm going to look forward to that. I'm going to put a date in your diary that we can actually come back and do it again. So if that's
I get
okay
to come back. Thanks, Robert.
But Neil, thank you very, very much. Thank you to
Pleasure.
our invisible audience, wherever they are. And please carry on following us, because I think this is exactly the sort of thing, if you've enjoyed it, it's the kind of thing we want to do. Thank you, Polly. And Polly, for those of you who wondered why Polly wasn't actually chipping in when I was chipping in, Polly was handling the PowerPoint slides. And when she was sharing her screen, she discovered that she couldn't actually participate, it seems. So anyway, thank you, Polly, as ever. And thank you all for being here. Stay safe. And see you all very soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Neil.
Thanks,
Robert.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.